You are standing outside a building, not a particularly distinguished building, not the kind of structure that announces its presence with architectural ambition or civic pride. It is a low, timber-framed building on a street that you have been directed to by someone who gave you the directions with a knowing look and a specific quality of studied casualness that suggested they definitely didn't know anything about this street from personal experience. The building has a sign above the door, not a painted sign with a name, because medieval commercial establishments rarely operated with the branding sophistication of the modern service industry, but a specific symbol or a distinctive color, or some other visual marker that the local population understood without the explanation that the tourist required. You are in Southwark. The year is approximately 1400. Southwark is on the south bank of the Thames, across the river from the city of London proper, in the specific geographical and jurisdictional position that made it the location for the activities that the City of London preferred to keep at arm's length while remaining close enough to access conveniently. Southwark had the theaters when the theaters eventually came. It had the bear-baiting arenas. It had the taverns. And it had the stews, the commercial establishments whose specific business the word brothel describes, and whose presence in Southwark was not merely tolerated, but was in one of the medieval period's more remarkable administrative arrangements, officially licensed and regulated. Let's be clear about what you are about to enter, because this script is going to be a serious historical examination of the medieval commercial sex industry, its regulation, its economics, its social position, the specific conditions of the people who worked in it, and the extraordinary complexity of the medieval society's relationship with an institution that it simultaneously condemned, regulated, taxed, and patronized. This is not salacious, or rather, it is only salacious in the way that honest history is sometimes salacious. In the way that examining the actual practices of actual historical humans in all their complexity inevitably involves the full range of human behavior, including the parts that the sanitized version leaves out. The medieval brothel was not the romantic institution that the romanticized version of the Middle Ages imagines. It was also not the unrelentingly grim institution that the moralistic version of history presents. It was something more complicated and more interesting than either. An institution embedded in the medieval social fabric in ways that tell you something specific and important about how the medieval world understood gender, commerce, poverty, sin, and the management of human desire. You wouldn't last a single night in a medieval brothel, not as a customer, not as a worker, not as a manager, for reasons that have nothing to do with the sexual activity itself and everything to do with the specific historical conditions of the medieval institution. The smell, the disease, the legal precarity, the violence, the social complexity, the specific economic exploitation of the women who worked there, the extraordinary regulatory framework that simultaneously protected and controlled them. These are the reasons. Let's go through them. Chapter 1. The regulation. The extraordinary fact that medieval brothels were officially licensed, and what that actually meant. The Bishop of Winchester owned the brothels. This is not a metaphor. This is not a colorful historical exaggeration designed to make a point about medieval clerical corruption. This is a literal, documented historical fact. The brothels of Southwark in medieval London were located on land owned by the Bishop of Winchester, and the Bishop of Winchester collected the rent from the operators of those establishments. The specific women who worked in the Southwark stews were consequently known in the specific slang of the period as Winchester geese, the bishop's geese, the women who brought the bishop his revenue through the specific commercial activity that the church officially condemned and the bishop officially facilitated by providing the real estate. The specific irony of this situation was not lost on the medieval population. It appears in the period's literature and satire with the knowing frequency of a joke that writes itself. But it was not merely a joke. It was the accurate description of a real institutional arrangement that the medieval city had developed for managing the commercial sex industry through a combination of official regulation, geographic containment, and financial exploitation that was, in its way, a model of municipal pragmatism. The formal regulation of the Southwark stews dates at least to 1161, when Henry II issued the specific ordinances, the rules of the stews that established the legal framework for the operation of the brothels in Southwark. The ordinances were detailed, specific, and reveal a great deal about the medieval approach to managing an institution that the church condemned as sinful and the civil authorities recognized as impossible to eliminate. The rules prohibited the brothel keepers from keeping women against their will. The specific provision that recognized the potential for coercion in the industry and attempted to address it through formal regulation. The women were to be free to leave if they chose. They were not to be locked in. They were not to be physically prevented from going. The rules prohibited the brothel keepers from charging the women excessive prices for food and accommodation. The specific provision that recognized the potential for the economic exploitation of the workers through the debt bondage that the combination of housing and employment created. The women were to be treated fairly in the commercial arrangement between them and the establishment. The rules prohibited married women from working in the stews. The specific provision that protected the institution of marriage from the complication of the wife's commercial sexual activity. A married woman in the stew was a canonical problem that the regulation attempted to prevent by exclusion. The rules required the women to have Sundays off. The specific provision that the church's influence on the civil regulation produced. The acknowledgement that even the women of the stews were entitled to the religious observance that the Sunday rest required. The rules prohibited the stew keepers from operating during Lent and during Holy Week, the specific periods of the Christian calendar when the church's requirements of abstinence extended even to the regulated commercial sex industry. The rules specified that the women were not to be solicited on the streets outside the stews. The specific geographic containment that kept the commercial sex industry within the regulated space and prevented it from spreading into the public streets of the city. These regulations tell you something important about the medieval approach to the commercial sex industry. It was the approach of practical management rather than principled prohibition. The medieval authorities who produced the 1,161 ordinances were not under the illusion that they could eliminate the commercial sex industry. They were attempting to manage it, to contain it geographically, to prevent the most egregious abuses, to generate revenue from its operation, and to maintain the specific social order that its unregulated existence threatened. The theological framework for this approach was provided by St. Augustine, whose specific formulation, remove prostitutes from human affairs, and you will unsettle everything through lust. Place them in the position of matrons, and you will produce dishonor and disgrace, was the specific authoritative statement that the medieval church used to justify the tolerance of the institution it condemned. The logic was the logic of the lesser evil. The commercial sex industry, properly contained and regulated, was less harmful to the social order than the alternative of the unregulated lust that its absence would unleash. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, repeated and elaborated this argument. Prostitution was like the palace sewer, ugly, smelly, and necessary. Remove it, and the palace becomes uninhabitable. The metaphor is not flattering to the institution or to the women who worked in it, but it captures the specific pragmatic logic that the medieval church used to justify the regulation, rather than the prohibition of the commercial sex industry. The practical administration of the regulation was the responsibility of the Lord of the Manor of Southwark. In practice, the Bishop of Winchester, who held the manor, and the specific enforcement of the ordinances was the administrative task of the stewholders, the operators of the individual establishments, who were licensed to operate within the regulatory framework and who were legally responsible for compliance with the rules. The license was the specific mechanism that gave the medieval brothel its quasi-official status, the document that the authority had issued permitting the operation of the establishment, and that the operator displayed as the evidence of their legal position. The license was not free. It required the payment of the fee that the licensing authority charged, and the regular payment of the rent that the land ownership relationship required. The stews were a revenue stream for the bishop, and the maintenance of the regulatory framework that made their operation possible was in the bishop's financial interest, as well as in the city's managerial interest. The specific number of the Southwark stews varied over time. The number licensed at any given point was typically between 12 and 18 in the specific area of Bankside that the bishop's land and the regulatory framework had designated as the permitted zone. The geographic containment was a specific feature of the licensing system that made the management possible. By restricting the licensed establishments to a specific area, the authorities created the conditions for the effective supervision that the regulation required. The dissolution of the stews happened in 1546, when Henry VIII issued the proclamation that closed the licensed establishments. The specific reasons for the closure are debated by historians. The role of syphilis, which had arrived in England in the late 15th century and was spreading through the population with the alarming efficiency of a new pathogen encountering a population with no prior immunity, is often cited as the primary cause. The unlicensed and unregulated establishment, which didn't operate under the rules that the EU official stews were supposed to follow, was also a factor. The specific problem of the unlicensed competition that the regulatory framework couldn't control. After 1546, the commercial sex industry in London continued to operate as it had before the licensing and as it would after, but without the specific official framework that the stews represented. The post-1546 industry was the underground industry, the unregulated industry, the industry without the specific protections, however imperfect, that the licensing system had provided for the women who worked in it. Chapter 2. The building, what the medieval brothel actually looked like, and why the reality was considerably less glamorous than the imagination. The building you have entered is not what you expected. Or rather, it is not what the various romantic and cinematic representations of the medieval brothel have led you to expect. The candlelit sophistication of the Hollywood medieval brothel, the velvet drapes and the seductive lighting, and the women in elaborate costume, was an aesthetic that the actual medieval Southwark stew did not aspire to and could not have achieved even if it had wanted to. The stew was a working-class commercial establishment operating in the specific material conditions of the medieval city, and the specific material conditions of the medieval city were not conducive to the candlelit velvet aesthetic. The building was a timber-framed structure of the kind that lined every commercial street in the medieval English city. Functional, durable in the specific way of timber frame construction, and not designed with the comfort of its occupants as the primary architectural consideration. The ground floor was typically the public space, the tavern or the drinking room, where the customers gathered before and between the specific commercial transactions that they had come to conduct. The medieval brothel was not exclusively a place of commercial sex. It was also a drinking establishment, a social space, a place where the men of the neighborhood and the travelers through the city gathered for the combination of drink and company that the tavern provided, and for the additional services that the stew provided beyond the ordinary tavern's offering. The combination of the drinking establishment and the commercial sex establishment was the specific business model that made the economics of the medieval stew work. The drink was the lubricant of the social occasion and the specific revenue stream that supplemented the income from the commercial sex. The women of the establishment served drinks as well as the other services. The specific role of the woman in the medieval tavern brothel was the role of the multifunctional service worker, whose tasks were not sharply distinguished in the way that the modern service industry's job descriptions would require. The smell was the first specific shock to the system of the modern visitor, not the smell of the commercial sex per se, but the smell of the building itself, which was the accumulated smell of the medieval building in its fully operational state, the wood smoke of the fire that provided the heating and the cooking, the specific animal smell of the rushes on the floor that had been accumulating the various biological contributions of the building's traffic, the smell of the bodies of the people in the building who had bathed with the frequency and thoroughness that the medieval period's hygiene infrastructure allowed, the smell of the specific food that the establishment sold alongside its other offerings, and the smell of the specific sanitation arrangements of the medieval building that were not the sanitation arrangements of the modern one. The stew in the name of the establishments was not a reference to the culinary preparation. The stew was the bathtub, the wooden tub filled with heated water that the medieval establishment provided to its customers. The hot bath was the specific amenity that the stew offered, and the bath was both a genuine hygienic service and the specific social activity around which the establishment's other services organized. The stew house was originally, in the medieval usage, the bathhouse, the establishment where the bath was the primary offering, and the additional services were the accompanying development that the bathhouse's specific social context made natural. The bathhouse brothel combination was not unique to England. It was the specific commercial development that the medieval European bathhouse produced in multiple locations. The combination of the bathing service and the commercial sex service that the medieval city's bathhouse culture found a natural pairing. The German Badestube and the French étuve and the various other European bathhouse traditions all showed the specific tendency toward the combination that the moral reformers of the period complained about with consistent regularity. The bathing tubs were in the specific rooms of the establishment that the commercial activity required, not the private individual bathrooms of the modern hotel, but the specific tubs in specific spaces where the bathing happened in the conditions of privacy that the physical layout of the building permitted. In some establishments, the bathing was communal, the large tub shared by multiple bathers, which the records of the period document, and which the moralists found additionally objectionable. The specific rooms of the medieval brothel were the rooms of the medieval commercial building, small, low-ceilinged, poorly lit by the standards of the modern eye, heated by the fire that was the building's primary heat source. The beds were the beds of the medieval commercial sleeping space. the straw mattress, or the slightly better quality version if the establishment aspired to the higher market, the wool blankets, the linen that was washed with the frequency that the establishment's management considered necessary and its resources permitted. The lice were present. This is not a dramatic addition to the description. It is the accurate description of the medieval sleeping space. The specific parasitic life of the medieval bed was the specific parasitic life of every medieval bed, and the medieval brothels beds were not exceptional in this respect, except possibly in the degree to which the traffic of the establishment increased the probability of the particular species transmission that the shared sleeping space encouraged. The rodents were present. The cats that the medieval establishment kept to manage the rodent population were present. The specific sounds of the medieval urban commercial establishment, the voices, the movement, the sounds from adjacent rooms, the sounds from the street outside, were present through the thin walls of the timber frame construction. The fire was the specific hazard that hung over the medieval urban building, with the perpetual imminence of a threat that the medieval fire management system, the wooden buildings, the open fires, the lack of organized firefighting beyond the bucket brigade, could reduce but could not eliminate. The medieval Southwark building that stood too close to its neighbor and whose fire management was inadequate was the medieval Southwark building that was a significant risk to the surrounding neighborhood. And the records of the medieval city's fire disasters include the specific events of the commercial districts, where the concentration of commercial activity had concentrated the fire risk. Chapter 3. The Economics. Who made money in the medieval sex trade, and how little of it went to the women. The economics of the medieval commercial sex industry were the economics of an industry in which the primary workers were in the weakest possible position, and the secondary participants, the landlords, the operators, the various intermediaries, were in the strongest possible position. This is not a unique feature of the medieval version of the industry. It is the structural feature that has characterized the commercial sex industry in most of its historical forms. But the medieval version had specific mechanisms of economic exploitation that the regulatory framework simultaneously addressed and reinforced. The women who worked in the stews were not typically the owners of the establishments in which they worked. They were the workers in the commercial enterprise that someone else owned and managed, and their relationship to that enterprise was the specific relationship of the vulnerable employee to the employer who controlled both their working conditions and their housing. The rent arrangement was the specific mechanism of economic exploitation that the medieval stew's combination of workplace and residence created. The woman in the stew lived in the stew. Her housing was the housing that the establishment provided, for which she paid rent to the establishment's operator. She ate in the stew. Her food was the food that the establishment provided, for which she paid the establishment's operator. She worked in the stew. Her income came from the commercial activity that the establishment facilitated, from which the establishment's operator took the specific cut that the commercial arrangement required. The specific result of this arrangement was the debt bondage that the 1,161 ordinances had attempted to address by prohibiting excessive charges for food and accommodation. The woman who owed the stew keeper for the rent and the food and the various other charges that the establishment levied was the woman whose debt to the establishment made it practically difficult to leave, regardless of the legal right to do so that the ordinances formally protected. The legal right to leave and the practical ability to leave were different things, and the economic structure of the stew arrangement was specifically designed to make the practical ability to leave difficult. The specific charges that the stew keepers levied on the women in their establishments were the charges of the monopoly supplier, the rent for the room at the rate that the stew keeper set, the food at the price the stewkeeper determined, the linen for the beds at the cost the stewkeeper specified, the woman who had entered the stew with debts, the specific situation of the woman who had been drawn into the industry by the specific combination of poverty and debt that made the initial entry seem like the available option. Was the woman who found the debt growing, rather than diminishing as the charges accumulated against the income. The clientele paid the stewkeeper rather than the individual woman in many cases. The specific commercial arrangement in which the customer's payment went to the house, and the woman received her portion of the payment from the house after the house had taken its share. The specific share arrangement varied by establishment and by the particular negotiation between the operator and the worker, but the structural advantage was always with the operator who controlled the payment collection and the accounting. The price of the service in the medieval stew was regulated in some periods. The specific attempt to prevent the price gouging that the monopoly commercial sex establishment could otherwise charge. The regulated price was intended to make the service accessible to the ordinary working class customer, while ensuring that the women received the basic income that the commercial arrangement required to function. The regulation of the price was also, from the woman's perspective, the regulation of her potential earning. The price ceiling that prevented the industry's income from rising with demand in the way that the unregulated market would permit. The economic alternatives for the women in the medieval stews were the economic alternatives available to women in the lower economic strata of the medieval society, which were limited: the domestic service, the textile work, the agricultural labor, the various forms of trade and small commerce. These were the options, and the specific wages of these options were the wages of the medieval female worker, which were consistently lower than the wages of the male worker performing comparable labor. The medieval gender wage gap was the specific economic context that made the commercial sex industry financially attractive relative to the alternatives, despite the specific social stigma, the specific health risks, and the specific legal precarity that the industry involved. The specific economic calculation that the medieval woman making the choice to enter the commercial sex industry was performing. The calculation of the commercial sex industry's income against the domestic services income, accounting for the specific costs and the specific risks of each, was the economic calculation of a person operating with very limited options. The choice, where it was a choice rather than a coercion, was not the choice of the person with good options choosing between them. It was the choice of the person with bad options, choosing the least bad one available. The operator of the medieval stew was in an entirely different economic position. The stewkeeper, typically male, though female operators were documented, was running a commercial establishment that combined multiple revenue streams: the rent from the women, the charges for food and accommodation, the cut from the commercial transactions, and potentially the income from the drinking establishment that the stew typically included. The stew operator who managed the establishment competently and maintained the specific relationships with the licensing authority that the continued operation required was running a genuinely profitable business. The Bishop of Winchester, collecting the rent from the Southwark stew operators, was at the top of the economic hierarchy. The landowner extracting the ground rent from the commercial activity on his land without the specific operational involvement that the stewkeeper's role required. The bishop's income from the stews was the income of the passive landlord, and the specific irony of the church collecting rent from the commercial sex establishment on land the church owned was the irony that the medieval satirists regularly exploited and that the modern historian regularly cites. The specific amounts involved were not negligible. The Southwark stews in their regulated form were generating significant revenue for the bishop, the stew operators, and the various other participants in the economic chain. The commercial sex industry was not a marginal economic activity in the medieval city. It was an embedded part of the commercial economy, generating revenue for participants at multiple levels of the economic hierarchy. Chapter 4: The women who worked in the medieval stews and what their lives actually looked like. The medieval woman who worked in the stews was not the figure that the mythology requires. The mythology requires either the victim, the innocent woman trapped in the industry by poverty or deception, defined entirely by her victimhood, or the libertine, the sexually free woman who has chosen the industry for personal reasons, defined entirely by her transgression of the moral code. Both of these mythological figures are simpler than the actual women who worked in the medieval commercial sex industry, whose specific situations reflected the full complexity of the individual lives that the historical record occasionally illuminates. What the historical record does clearly show is the demographic profile of the women who worked in the stews. They were predominantly young. The age of entry into the industry was typically in the late teens or early 20s, reflecting both the commercial preference for youth and the specific economic desperation that was most acute in the period of the young woman's independent economic survival before the household formation that marriage might eventually provide. They were predominantly from the lower economic strata of the medieval society, the daughters of the poor craftsmen and the agricultural laborers, and the urban working poor, the women for whom the specific economic alternatives to the commercial sex industry were the least attractive alternatives available. The woman who entered the commercial sex industry from a background of relative economic security was the exception. The specific stories of the well-born woman who had fallen into the industry through the specific catastrophe of the family's economic ruin or the violence of an individual crisis, rather than the norm. They were predominantly not from Southwark itself or from London. The specific mobility that the medieval commercial sex industry required, the movement from the home community, where the social stigma of the industry would be most damaging to family relationships and future options, meant that the women who worked in the Southwark stews were typically women who had come from somewhere else. The specific biographical pattern of the migration from the provincial town or the rural village to the city, where the anonymity of the urban environment made the entry into the industry possible without the specific social consequences that the home community would have imposed, is a pattern that appears in the documentary record of the medieval commercial sex industry. The health of the women in the stews was the health of the medieval working woman in an occupation with specific additional health risks. The general health risks of the medieval lower-class life, the nutritional insufficiency of the limited diet, the specific disease burden of the medieval urban environment, the inadequate medical care of the person without the financial resources to access the medical profession's better practitioners, were the baseline health situation that the women in the stews shared with the broader population of the medieval urban poor. The specific additional health risks of the commercial sex industry were the risks of the sexually transmitted infections that the medieval world had documented, if imperfectly understood. The gonorrhea, the burning, or the hot disease of the medieval medical literature was a well-documented occupational hazard of the industry, and the specific medical provisions that some of the medieval regulations attempted to establish for the management of the infected worker reflected the awareness that the occupational exposure to sexually transmitted infection was a genuine health risk that the regulatory framework needed to address. The regulations about the diseased worker were, in some formulations, the specific provisions that required the infected woman to stop working until the infection had resolved. the specific attempt to prevent the transmission of the infection to the customers that the commercial relationship created. The specific enforcement of this provision was the specific problem that the limited medieval medical diagnostic capacity and the specific economic incentive of the worker to continue working despite infection made genuinely difficult. The arrival of syphilis in England in the late 15th century, the specific disease that the new pathogen introduced from the Americas through the Spanish and Portuguese maritime contacts created in the European population without prior immunity, changed the health situation of the commercial sex industry dramatically. The syphilis that swept through Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was, in its initial manifestations, more virulent than the endemic syphilis of subsequent centuries, the new pathogen in a new population, producing the specific severity of disease that the established pathogen in the partially immune population did not. The women of the Southwark stews who encountered syphilis in the late 15th century were encountering a disease whose severity, whose course, and whose available treatment the mercury preparations of the period, applied externally and internally in doses that were themselves significantly toxic, were all significantly worse than anything the medieval medical tradition had previously managed in the specific context of the sexually transmitted infection. The mortality from the syphilis epidemic of the late 15th century in the commercial sex industry's workers was the specific mortality of the occupational group with the highest exposure to the most virulent phase of the new pathogen. And it was this mortality, alongside the broader epidemic's impact on the general population, that contributed to the specific pressure on the regulatory authorities to close the licensed establishments in 1546. The social position of the woman in the stews was the social position of the specifically stigmatized person in the medieval social order. The medieval church's condemnation of the commercial sex industry, the formal moral framework that identified the commercial sex worker as the sinner, the woman who had violated the specific moral code that the church defined, was the official ideological framework within which the industry's workers existed. The specific legal disabilities that the medieval law imposed on the woman identified as a prostitute were the disabilities of the person who had been categorized as outside the protection of the normal law. The woman in the stew could not bring certain kinds of legal actions. She could not be buried in consecrated ground without the specific dispensation that the church might or might not grant. She was required in some jurisdictions and some periods to wear the specific identifying clothing that marked her status, the striped hood, the specific color, the visual marker that the regulatory framework imposed to make her status publicly visible, the specific cruelty of the marking requirement, the obligation to identify yourself publicly as a person in the stigmatized category, to make your status visible to everyone who encountered you, to carry the social stigma not just in the social knowledge of your community, but in the literal visibility of your clothing, was the specific intersection of the moral condemnation and the regulatory control that the medieval management of the commercial sex industry produced. Chapter 5: The customers who used the medieval stews and what the social reality of their visit looked like. The customers of the medieval stews were not a socially uniform group. The mythology of the medieval brothel, like the mythology of the medieval tavern, tends toward the assumption that the customers were the socially marginal, the lower-class men, the morally disreputable, the people whose presence in the establishment reflected their location on the fringes of the respectable social world. The historical record of the medieval commercial sex industry does not support this assumption. The customers of the Southwark stews were men of every social level: the laborer and the merchant, the student and the priest, the knight, and the minor nobleman, the traveler through London on his way to somewhere more important, who found in the specific geographic concentration of the Southwark stews the specific commercial service that the licensed establishment provided. The geographic concentration and the licensing were the specific features that made the Southwark stews identifiable and accessible to the customer who wanted to use them, and accessibility worked in both directions of the social hierarchy. The clergy were among the customers who the ecclesiastical records document with the specific frequency that the repeated prohibitions on clerical visits to the stews imply. The prohibition that had to be repeatedly issued was the prohibition that was being repeatedly violated, and the repeated violation by the clergy was the specific evidence of the clerical presence in the industry that the moralists found most useful as evidence of institutional hypocrisy. The priest who had delivered the sermon against the sins of the flesh that Sunday and who was in the Southwark stew by Monday evening was not the exception of this specifically hypocritical individual. He was the representative of the pattern that the medieval moralists complained about, with the resignation of people who knew that the complaint was not going to produce the behavioral change they nominally wanted. The student was the other specific customer type that the medieval records document with the frequency of an established pattern. The student in the medieval city, the young man attending the cathedral school, or the university far from home, in the specific social environment of the student community, where the peer dynamics reinforce the specific masculine behaviors that the student culture celebrated, was the specific demographic whose presence in the commercial sex establishments was documented, satirized, and deplored in the medieval literature with a consistency that suggests the pattern was genuine and widespread. The married man was also a customer. The medieval moral framework's condemnation of the commercial sex visit was the condemnation of the sin, and the sin was the same whether the man committing it was married or unmarried. The specific additional complication of the married man's sin, the violation of the marital fidelity that the church prescribed, was the additional layer of condemnation that the married customer carried, but it did not appear to be an effective deterrent. The marriage of the customer was not necessarily a barrier to his use of the commercial sex establishment, and the records of the medieval courts that dealt with the consequences of the commercial sex industry's operation document the married customer alongside the unmarried one. The journey to the stews was the specific journey that the medieval man made across the river from the city of London, the crossing by the London Bridge, or by the various ferries that the Thames crossing required in the period before the bridge was supplemented by additional crossings, to the specific South Bank district where the licensed establishments operated. The geographic separation of the stews from the city proper was the specific regulatory containment that the licensing system imposed, and the crossing of the river was the specific threshold that the journey to the stews required. The journey was not the anonymous journey of the person who could reasonably expect not to be recognized. The medieval social world was the social world of the small community, even in the relative anonymity of the city, and the specific journey to the Southwark stews was a journey that could be made by the person who was willing to accept the possibility of recognition. The specific social risk of the recognized visit, the damage to the reputation that the recognition of the man in the stew neighborhood produced, was a risk that the customers accepted because the alternative, not visiting the stews, was, for the specific customers who visited regularly, the less acceptable alternative. The experience of the visit was the experience of the medieval commercial space in its specific operational reality. The drinking that preceded and accompanied the commercial transaction was the specific social lubricant that the tavern-brothel combination provided, and the specific behavioral effects of the medieval ale and wine on the customer's judgment, restraint, and management of the commercial transaction were the behavioral effects of alcohol in a commercial context that has not changed fundamentally since the medieval period. The violence of the visit was the specific risk that the commercial sex establishment's specific conditions created. The customer who was drunk, whose judgment was impaired by the alcohol, who found in the specific power dynamics of the commercial transaction the opportunity for the specific assertion of physical dominance that the drunk, entitled customer of any service industry generates. This customer was the specific risk that the women in the stews faced in the ordinary course of their working lives. The 1,161 ordinances had not included specific provisions about the physical safety of the women from the customers. The regulatory framework was the framework of the commercial regulation, rather than the framework of the criminal justice response to workplace violence. The woman in the stew who was assaulted by a customer was the woman who had the specific legal remedy of the court. She could bring an action for assault in principle, but whose practical access to that remedy was limited by the specific legal disabilities that her status imposed, and by the specific practical difficulty of prosecuting the customer who had the social power that she lacked. Chapter 6. The disease. What was actually happening to people's bodies in the medieval stews, and why it was considerably worse than you think the medieval doctor did not know what a germ was. This is the specific foundational fact that separates the medieval encounter with the sexually transmitted infection from the modern encounter in the most consequential possible way. The germ theory of disease. The specific revolutionary understanding that infectious diseases are caused by specific microorganisms, that transmission happens through specific mechanisms, and that the interruption of those mechanisms prevents the transmission, was the 19th century's contribution to the medical understanding that the medieval world was entirely without. What the medieval world had instead was the humoral theory, the specific medical framework that attributed disease to the imbalance of the four humors of the body: the blood and the phlegm and the yellow bile and the black bile, whose proper balance constituted health, and whose imbalance produced the specific disease conditions that the physician diagnosed and treated by attempting to restore the balance. The humoral diagnosis of the gonorrhea. The burning discharge that the medieval medical literature documented as the burning or the running of the rains was the humoral diagnosis of the excess of the hot, moist humor that the specific condition produced, and the humoral treatment was the treatment that addressed the excess by the specific means that the humoral theory prescribed. The treatment was not effective, not in the sense that the humoral treatment produced no result. The cooling herbs and the specific dietary restrictions that the humoral treatment prescribed produced the subjective experience of the treatment, which is not nothing, but effective in the sense of addressing the actual cause of the condition and resolving it. The humoral treatment was not this. The gonorrhea that the stew worker contracted from the customer and that the customer contracted from the stew worker circulated through the medieval commercial sex establishment without the specific interruption that the effective treatment would have provided. The specific symptoms of the gonorrhea in the medieval period were the symptoms that the medieval medical literature described with the specific clinical directness of the observer who was recording what they saw. The discharge, the burning sensation, the specific pain of the urination, the progression in the untreated case to the complications that the pelvic inflammatory disease and the epididymitis produced. The medieval patient who presented to the physician with these symptoms was the patient who received the humoral diagnosis and the humoral treatment, and who recovered or didn't recover based on the specific balance of the infection's natural course and the body's immune response, rather than on the effectiveness of the physician's intervention. The gonorrhea was endemic in the medieval commercial sex industry, in the specific sense of the disease that was constantly present, constantly circulating, constantly infecting and reinfecting the population of the stews. The woman who worked in the stew long enough contracted gonorrhea. The question was not whether, but when. And the question of what happened next was the question of whether the specific complications of the untreated infection, the pelvic inflammatory disease that the ascending infection produced in the female reproductive tract, the specific damage to the fallopian tubes and the ovaries that the chronic infection caused, developed before the infection resolved spontaneously or through the body's immune response. The complications were permanent. The specific damage to the female reproductive anatomy that the ascending gonorrheal infection produced was not the damage that the body repaired after the infection resolved. It was the scar tissue and the structural damage that remained after the acute infection was gone, producing the specific long-term consequences of the chronic pelvic pain and the infertility that the medieval woman who had survived the acute infection carried forward into the remainder of her life. The syphilis that arrived in England in the 1490s was the disease that changed everything. The specific historical debate about the origin of syphilis, the Columbian hypothesis that argues that the disease was brought from the Americas by Columbus's returning sailors, the pre-Columbian hypothesis that argues that the disease existed in Europe before 1492, in a form that the historical record has not clearly distinguished, is a debate that remains unresolved in some of its specifics, but the epidemic character of the late 15th century syphilis outbreak in Europe is not debated. Something new and terrible arrived in Europe in the 1490s, and it killed people fast and visibly, and in ways that the medical tradition had not previously documented. The Great Pox, the name that the contemporaries gave to the syphilis epidemic, distinguishing it from the smallpox that was the existing disease of the same common name, was the specific disease that swept through the European population in the late 1490s and the early 1500s, with the specific virulence of the new pathogen encountering the immunologically naive population, the soldiers of the Italian wars, the specific military campaigns that the French invasion of Italy in 1494 set in motion, the campaigns that moved large numbers of men from multiple European nations through the same geographic spaces in the conditions of military service that favored the transmission of the sexually transmitted infection, were the specific population through which the initial epidemic spread across Europe with the speed that the military movement allowed. The symptoms of the early syphilis epidemic were the symptoms of the disease in its most virulent phase. The chancres of the primary infection, the rash, and the fever of the secondary infection. The specific tertiary manifestations of the untreated infection that the medieval population encountered in the forms of the gummas, and the cardiovascular damage, and the neurological destruction of the neurosyphilis that the long course of the untreated infection eventually produced. The medieval population that encountered these symptoms was encountering something it had not seen before, and the specific terror of the unknown disease was the terror of the population that understood it was facing something outside the existing medical tradition's capacity to manage. The mercury treatment was the medieval response to the syphilis, the specific, toxic, partially effective treatment that the medical tradition developed in the early years of the epidemic and maintained as the primary therapeutic intervention for the subsequent centuries. The mercury was administered externally, in the ointments rubbed into the skin, and internally in the preparations that the patient ingested, in the doses that the medical tradition calibrated through the specific experience of the toxic effects that indicated the body was receiving enough mercury to be therapeutic. The therapeutic effect of the mercury on syphilis was real. Mercury has genuine antimicrobial properties that the modern bacteriology confirms. But the therapeutic dose and the toxic dose were dangerously close together, and the specific mercury toxicity that the treatment produced was itself a significant medical problem. The patient being treated for syphilis with mercury was the patient experiencing the mercury's specific toxicological effects, the salivation, the neurological symptoms, the renal damage, the specific damage to the teeth and the jaw that the chronic mercury exposure produced. The treatment was, in specific cases, the cause of symptoms that the observer could not easily distinguish from the disease. The woman in the Southwark stew, after 1495, was the woman operating in an environment where the syphilis had been added to the gonorrhea as the occupational health risk, and where the available treatment for the more dangerous of the two infections was a treatment that was itself significantly toxic. The specific calculation of the health risk of working in the stew in the post-syphilis period was the calculation of a person who was working in a genuinely dangerous environment without the knowledge of the mechanism of the disease's transmission, without the effective treatment that the knowledge of the mechanism would eventually enable, and without the specific protective technologies that the knowledge of the mechanism made possible. Chapter 7. The violence, the specific dangers that the medieval stew's working environment created, and how the law failed to address them. The law offered theoretical protection, not no protection. The specific qualifier is important because the picture of the medieval woman in the commercial sex industry as entirely without legal recourse is the picture that the legal idealism of the 1,161 ordinances, combined with the practical reality of their enforcement, requires complicating. The ordinances existed. They prohibited certain things. They established certain rights. And the gap between the rights that the ordinances established and the practical ability to enforce those rights was the specific gap that the medieval legal system produced between the theoretical protection and the actual protection. The violence in the medieval stew was the violence of the specific environment that the combination of the alcohol, the power differential, and the legal precarity of the workers created. The customer who was drunk had the specific impaired judgment of the drunk person, combined with the specific entitled relationship to the service worker that the commercial transaction created in the mind of the person who had paid and who therefore considered the service purchased to be the service owed. The specific violence that the drunk entitled customer of the commercial sex establishment directed at the worker was the violence that the worker had the formal right to report to the constable and the practical difficulty of getting the constable to take seriously. The constable's response to the complaint of the woman in the stews was the response of the medieval law enforcement officer, whose specific understanding of the moral status of the complainant was the understanding of the woman in the stigmatized category. The woman whose legal disabilities, whose social position, whose specific occupation placed her in the category of the person whose complaint required more evidence and less credulity than the complaint of the respectable woman. The specific evidentiary standard that the medieval legal system effectively applied to the assault complaint of the stew worker was a standard that the respectable woman's complaint was not held to, and the specific differential in the credibility that the legal system assigned to the two complainants was the specific legal consequence of the moral framework that had designated the stew worker as the fallen woman whose experience of violence was somehow less urgently requiring of the legal response. The violence was not only the violence of the customers. The stew keeper, the operator of the establishment who controlled the economic and physical environment in which the women worked, was also a potential source of violence in the specific form of the coercive management that the power relationship between the employer who controlled the housing and the worker who depended on the housing for her economic survival created. The woman who was housed in the stew, who owed rent to the stew keeper, whose income passed through the stew keeper's accounting. This woman's ability to resist the stew keeper's demands, including the demands that went beyond the commercial terms of the original arrangement, was the limited ability of the person whose economic situation had been arranged to minimize her leverage. The 1,161 ordinances' prohibition on keeping women against their will was the specific provision that addressed this coercive potential. The provision was real. Its enforcement was the enforcement of the provision in the specific conditions of the medieval legal system. The constable who was asked to investigate the stew keeper's detainment of the worker, the magistrate who considered the evidence, the specific practical difficulty of the woman who was economically dependent on the establishment she was trying to leave, demonstrating that her inability to leave was coerced rather than chosen. The organized violence of the medieval stew environment was the violence that the association between the commercial sex industry and the criminal elements of the medieval city produced. The stew neighborhood was the neighborhood of the specific urban geography that the concentration of the commercial sex establishments created. The geographic concentration of the economically marginal, the criminally connected, the socially stigmatized, that the regulated zone attracted in addition to the legitimate commercial traffic that the establishments generated, the specific criminal enterprises that operated in proximity to the stews, the theft, the robbery, the various forms of the confidence crime that the intoxicated and the morally compromised customer was vulnerable to, were the specific crimes of the environment that the stew created. The rollman, the specific medieval term for the man who rolled the drunk customer, who robbed the intoxicated man making his way home from the Southwark stews, was the specific criminal entrepreneur of the stew neighborhood, the person whose business model depended on the specific vulnerability that the stew's combination of alcohol and the socially compromised situation created in the customer who was not in a position to report the robbery without explaining why he had been in the stew neighborhood at the relevant hour. The specific protection racket that the criminal element of the stew neighborhood operated. The informal tax on the stew operators extracted through the threat of violence or interference with their operations was the specific parallel economy that the regulated commercial sex establishment generated in the way that any regulated commercial enterprise operating in the proximity of the criminal economy generates the specific criminal parasitism that exploits the legitimate enterprise's vulnerability. The physical confrontation between the customers of different establishments, the specific violence of the rival customer groups that the concentration of establishments in a single geographic area produced, was another dimension of the medieval stew's violent environment. The medieval masculine culture's specific investment in the defense of the personal honor, combined with the alcohol and the competitive presence of other men in the same commercially charged environment, produced the specific conditions for the interpersonal violence that the records of the medieval courts document deal with the frequency of the regular occurrence rather than the exceptional event. The weaponry was present. The medieval man who went about his daily business carried the knife that the period's customs required for the practical purposes of the daily life. And the knife that went to the tavern with its owner was the knife that the tavern's specific dynamics occasionally deployed in the interpersonal conflicts that the tavern environment generated. The stew that included the tavern was the stew that included the specific concentration of the armed, the drunk, and the competitively engaged that the knife violence of the medieval period required only the specific provocation to express. Chapter 8. The rest of Europe. How different cities managed the same problem and what their approaches reveal. The Southwark model was not the only model. The medieval European cities' management of the commercial sex industry was the management of the same fundamental problem. The specific combination of the universal demand, the theological condemnation, and the practical impossibility of elimination. Through the specific institutional solutions that the different legal traditions, the different municipal cultures, and the different relationships between the civil and the ecclesiastical authority produced in each city's particular context. The result was not uniformity. The medieval European city produced a variety of approaches to the management of the commercial sex industry that the historian of the subject finds genuinely interesting as the evidence of the different ways in which the same problem can be addressed when the specific institutional context varies. The comparison of the different approaches illuminates both the specific features of the English model and the specific range of alternatives that the medieval city could produce. The municipal brothel was the specific institution that a number of continental European cities developed as an alternative to the private licensed establishment of the English model. The city-owned and city-operated brothel, the establishment that the municipal authority ran as a public institution rather than licensing private operators to run, was the specific administrative solution that the cities of southern France and the German states found attractive in the 14th and 15th centuries. The municipal brothel had the specific advantages of the directly administered institution. The city controlled the operation, determined the conditions, set the prices, managed the staffing, and extracted the revenue directly, rather than through the intermediary of the private operator, whose profit motive might conflict with the regulatory requirements. The Avignon municipal brothel, established in the 14th century, was the specific example that the French municipal tradition produced. The city operating the establishment as a direct municipal service, in the way that the city operated the public baths and the market. The specific social position of the municipal brothel in the continental tradition was the social position of the quasi-public institution, the establishment that the city had officially adopted as its own, rather than merely tolerating at arm's length. The municipal brothel of the southern French and German city was the establishment that the city council supervised, that the city council's regulations governed in detail, and that the city council's periodic inspections assessed for compliance with the standards that the municipal authority had established. The women who worked in the municipal brothels of the continental tradition were the women whose relationship to the municipal authority was the specific relationship of the worker in the directly supervised institution, more regulated in specific ways than the women of the privately operated English stew, and therefore more subject to the specific institutional control that the direct supervision created. The municipal authority's direct management of the staffing meant that the municipal authority had the direct power to admit women to the institution and to remove them in the specific administrative way of the institution whose gates were controlled by the civil authority rather than the private operator. The civic procession was the specific, extraordinary institution that some continental cities developed around the municipal brothel, the practice of incorporating the women of the brothel into the specific civic ceremonial occasions that the city organized, the processions and the festivals, and the formal welcoming of the important visitor that the medieval civic culture used to demonstrate its institutional coherence and its capacity for organized collective display. The women of the municipal brothel participated in these events in the specific regulated way that the civic ceremonial required, marching in the assigned position in the procession, wearing the specific dress that the civic regulation prescribed. The specific institution of the civic procession that incorporated the brothel workers was the specific fascinating example of the medieval city's complex relationship with the commercial sex industry, the institution that the city officially condemned, but that the city also officially included in the specific ceremonial occasions that represented the city to itself and to the world. The civic procession with the brothel workers in their assigned position was the medieval city's specific, embodied acknowledgement of the commercial sex industry as an institution that was part of the city's social fabric, however problematically, rather than an external contaminant that the city merely tolerated at its margins. The Venetian approach was the specific model that the most sophisticated and most commercially developed of the medieval Italian cities produced. Venice's management of the commercial sex industry was the management of the city-state, whose commercial sophistication extended to the organization of the vice trade, alongside the organization of the spice trade, and the banking system, and the various other commercial enterprises that the Venetian economy had developed into the most elaborately organized commercial system in the medieval world. The Venetian Rialto prostitution district was the specific geographic concentration of the commercial sex industry that the Venetian municipal regulation created and maintained. The Castelletto, the specific building complex on the Rialto island that the Venetian authorities designated as the permitted zone for the commercial sex industry, and that the women who worked in the industry were required to inhabit if they wanted the specific legal protections that the regulated status provided. The specific Venetian innovation was the attempt to make the commercial sex industry a positive contribution to the city's attractiveness as a commercial destination. The specific explicit argument that the availability of the regulated commercial sex industry was the specific amenity that made Venice the attractive destination for the merchants and the travelers, whose commercial activity the city needed to sustain its economy. The Venetian authorities who made this argument were making the argument of the commercial strategist, who had decided to treat the vice trade as a feature rather than a bug of the commercial city's offering. The German Frauenhaus was the specific German institutional version of the municipal brothel, the women's house that the imperial city operated as the direct municipal establishment in the way that the French cities operated the municipal brothel, with the specific German institutional character of the thoroughly regulated, carefully administered public institution. The records of the German Frauenhaus are among the most detailed of the medieval commercial sex industry's documentary record, because the municipal administration of the German city kept the specific administrative records that the direct operation required. Chapter 9. The Resistance. How medieval women in the sex trade fought back, organized, and occasionally won. The women were not passive. This is the specific corrective that the history of the medieval commercial sex industry most consistently requires. The corrective to the picture of the women in industry as the passive victims of the institutional structures that surrounded them, without agency, without resistance, without the specific, various creative strategies of the person who is navigating a genuinely hostile environment and who has developed the specific tools of navigation that the hostile environment makes necessary. The women of the medieval stews had agency, not the unconstrained agency of the person operating in a fair and open social system. The constraints were real, the power differentials were real, the specific economic and legal vulnerabilities were real and serious, but the agency of the person within the constraints, the specific practical daily agency of the person who is making choices and deploying strategies and building relationships and accumulating resources within the specific structural limitations that the situation imposes. That agency was present. The historical record, read carefully, documents it. The collective complaint was the specific form of organized resistance that the women of the stews employed when the individual complaint was insufficient to address the abuse. The records of the medieval courts include cases in which groups of women from the stews brought collective actions against the stew keepers who had violated the regulatory provisions. The excessive charges for food and accommodation, the physical coercion, the specific violations of the 1,161 ordinances that the individual woman might have been unable to pursue alone, but that the collective action of the group could bring to the attention of the licensing authority. The specific collective action that the women of the Southwark stews brought against the abusive stew keeper was not the organized labor action of the modern trade union. It was the specific legal complaint of the aggrieved party to the authority that the licensing framework had established as the specific referee of the disputes between the operators and the workers. The licensing authority, the lord of the manor, the bishop's representative, the specific administrative official who managed the regulated zone, was the person to whom the collective complaint was addressed, and the specific record of these complaints in the administrative record of the stews is the specific evidence that the women used the regulatory framework's own mechanisms to resist the specific abuses that the regulatory framework was supposed to prevent. The exit was the other form of resistance, the specific practical strategy of leaving the stew that was abusing the woman for the stew that was not. The 1,161 ordinances' formal protection of the right to leave was not always enforceable in the specific cases where the debt bondage made practical departure difficult, but the record also shows the specific cases where the woman exercised the formal right in the practical way. Moving from one establishment to another in the same regulated zone, from the Southwark stew to the stew in another city, from the licensed establishment to the independent operation that the regulatory framework didn't supervise and didn't provide income for. The independent operator, the woman who worked outside the licensed establishment, without the stew keeper's cut and without the stew keeper's protection, was the specific economic option that the woman with sufficient resources and sufficient social capital to manage independently chose, in preference to the licensed establishment's economic arrangement. The independent operator was the woman working outside the regulatory framework, which meant she was working without the specific, imperfect protections that the regulatory framework provided, but also without the specific economic exploitation that the stew keeper's portion represented. The street-level independence that some medieval commercial sex workers maintained, operating without the stew keeper's economic claim on their income. Without the stew keeper's control over their housing, was the specific economic form of the resistance that the most economically resourceful and least dependent women achieved. It was also the form of operation that the regulatory framework designated as illegal, which meant that the independent operator was the operator who faced the specific legal sanction of the system that the licensed establishment was complying with, and she was not. The marriage was the specific strategy of the exit from the industry that the medieval social framework provided as the theoretical path, the marriage that transformed the woman from the commercial sex worker into the wife, from the legally disabled to the legally covered, from the social outcast to the social member of the household. The marriage from the stew was the marriage that the social stigma of the woman's former occupation made genuinely difficult in the specific way that the medieval community's knowledge of its members' histories made concealment of that history hard. But it happened. The specific records of the medieval court and the church that document the marriages of women who had previously worked in the commercial sex industry, the women who had left the industry, who had found the partner who was willing to marry despite the history, who had built the new social identity that the marriage enabled, are the evidence that the exit was not merely theoretical. The path was narrow, and the journey was difficult, but some women completed it. The religious conversion and the entry into the charitable institution were the other specific path of exit that the medieval social framework provided. The Magdalene houses, the specific charitable institutions that the medieval church developed for the reception and the rehabilitation of the women leaving the commercial sex industry, were the church's specific institutional response to the pastoral problem of the woman in the industry who wanted to leave and needed the specific support that the exit required. The Magdalene institution was not universally welcoming. The specific conditions that the institution imposed on the women it received, the specific religious requirements, and the specific behavioral expectations of the penitent who had come to be reformed were the conditions that some women found acceptable and others found as constraining in their specific way, as the stew had been in its. But the institution existed. The exit path was real, and the women who took it were the women who had found in the specific religious framework the specific support that the secular world was not reliably providing. Chapter 10. The church, the institution that condemned the stews, collected the rent, and tried to save the souls of the women inside them. The church had 3 positions on the medieval brothel simultaneously. Not 1 position, not 2 positions. 3 maintained at the same time, in the specific institutional incoherence that the medieval church produced whenever its theological commitments, its financial interests, and its pastoral responsibilities converged on the same institution in ways that made the coherent single position impossible. The first position was condemnation. The commercial sex industry was sinful. The women who worked in it were sinners. The men who used it were sinners. The operators who profited from it were sinners. The sin was the sin of fornication, the specific sexual activity outside the sacramental marriage that the church's sexual theology prohibited, compounded by the commercial character of the transaction that made it additionally degraded. The theologians who wrote about the commercial sex industry wrote about it in terms that left the moral status of the activity in no doubt. It was sinful. The church condemned it. The second position was the Augustinian tolerance. Remove the prostitute from human affairs, and you unsettle everything through lust. The commercial sex industry was the lesser evil that the realistic assessment of the human situation required tolerating, the specific pragmatic acknowledgement that the prohibition of the industry would not eliminate the demand, but would merely drive the industry underground, where it could not be regulated, supervised, or subjected to the specific pastoral attention that the church's third position required. The third position was the pastoral engagement. The women in the stews were sinners, but they were also souls, the specific, individual, immortal souls, whose salvation was the church's pastoral responsibility, and whose specific situation required the specific pastoral response that the institution had developed for the person in the sinful occupation who was nonetheless entitled to the church's spiritual care. The Magdalene tradition, the specific devotion to the figure of Mary Magdalene, the reformed sinner of the gospel narrative, whose story the medieval church used as the specific template for the rehabilitation of the woman in the commercial sex industry, was the pastoral framework through which the church engaged with the women it simultaneously condemned, exploited through the bishop's rent, and offered the possibility of redemption. The three positions operated simultaneously, and the institutional incoherence they produced was the incoherence of the organization that had genuine commitments in multiple directions and was not prepared to resolve the tension between them by abandoning any one commitment. The bishop who collected the rent from the Southwark stews was the same bishop who presided over the diocese, whose clergy preached against the sin of fornication every Sunday. The same institutional authority held both positions. The specific personal comfort of the bishop with this arrangement is not documented. The arrangement itself is. The pastoral engagement with the women of the stews was the specific work of the mendicant orders. The Aurs, Franciscans, and the Dominicans, the mobile, poverty-committed religious orders, whose specific mission was the engagement with the urban poor in the streets and the alleys, and the specific spaces of the city where the secular parish priest was less likely to go. The Franciscan or the Dominican who entered the Southwark stew to preach to the women was not the bishop collecting the rent. He was the specific institutional agent of the church's third position, the pastor making the practical pastoral visit to the specific population whose souls the church claimed responsibility for. The preaching in the stews was the specific pastoral activity that the medieval documents record with the matter-of-fact directness of the routine rather than the exceptional. The friar who preached in the stew was the friar doing his regular pastoral work in the specific location that his specific mission required him to visit, and the women who heard the preaching were the women who received the specific message that the pastoral tradition delivered to the commercial sex worker, the message of the sin acknowledged, the repentance available, the redemption possible, the Magdalene's story as the specific narrative that made the trajectory from sinner to saint a documented historical possibility. The conversion of the commercial sex worker was the specific pastoral success that the medieval religious culture celebrated when it occurred. The woman who left the stew and entered the religious life, who took the vows and became the penitent, whose transformation from the Winchester goose to the bride of Christ was the specific dramatic narrative of the grace that the pastoral engagement had produced. The Magdalene houses that the medieval church established were the specific institutional reception for the women whose conversion the pastoral engagement had produced. The place to which the converted woman came, bringing the specific baggage of her former life and the specific hope of the new identity that the religious house offered. The specific tension between the church's condemnation of the industry and its financial stake in the industry's continuation was not a tension that the medieval church formally acknowledged or formally resolved. It was the specific institutional contradiction that the medieval commentators noted with the satirist's appreciation for the hypocrisy embedded in the powerful institution's relationship with the sinful activity it condemned and profited from simultaneously. The tension was real. The acknowledgement of the tension was the work of the satirist, rather than the institutional theologian. Chapter 11. The language. What the medieval vocabulary of the sex trade reveals about how people thought about it. The words were specific, not the euphemistic, circumlocutory vocabulary of the Victorian era that would follow, not the clinical terminology of the modern medical and legal discourse, not the explicit vocabulary of the contemporary culture's reduced tolerance for the indirect reference. The medieval vocabulary of the commercial sex industry was the vocabulary of the society that discussed the subject with the specific directness of the culture that had not yet developed the specific Victorian anxiety about the publicly mentionable, combined with the specific creative use of the metaphor and the euphemism that the social complexity of discussing a condemned activity in mixed company required. The word stew itself is the starting point, the specific revealing etymology that traces the word from the bathhouse to the brothel through the specific historical development that the southward establishments represented. The stew was the bath. The bath became the brothel. The word traveled with the institutional development, retaining the innocuous, original meaning, while accumulating the additional meaning that the institution's specific development had produced. The word stew in the medieval English context was therefore the word that the knowledgeable person understood in both its meanings, and that the person of strategic naivety could claim to understand in only one. The Winchester goose was the specific term for the woman who worked in the Southwark stews, the specific pointed metaphor that linked the woman to the bishop through the commercial relationship that the goose and keeper metaphor expressed. The goose was the productive animal that generated the income for the keeper who owned it. The Winchester geese generated the rental income for the Bishop of Winchester, who owned the land they worked on. The metaphor was exact. Its point was the point of the satire that exposed the bishop's specific financial relationship with the industry he was supposed to condemn, and its circulation in the medieval popular culture was the circulation of the joke that the medieval population found funny enough to repeat and specific enough to preserve. The term meretrix, the Latin word for the commercial sex worker, derived from the Latin merere, to earn, was the specific terminology of the ecclesiastical and legal documents that required the formal designation of the person in the industry. The meretrix was the woman who earned in the specific way, the woman whose income derived from the specific commercial activity that the legal and ecclesiastical frameworks needed to designate precisely for the purposes of the specific legal disabilities and the specific pastoral provisions that the designation triggered. The Latin term in the legal document was the formal designation. The Winchester goose in the popular discourse was the same person seen from the different angle of the satirical observation. The vocabulary of the customers was the vocabulary that the medieval culture maintained in the specific register of the knowing reference that communicated the specific activity without stating it explicitly. The man who visited Southwark, or who crossed the river, or who went to the stews, was the man whose destination and purpose the knowing interlocutor understood without the specific statement that the explicit reference would have required. The medieval culture's specific vocabulary of the knowing indirection, the reference that communicated through the specific context rather than the explicit statement, was the vocabulary that allowed the discussion of the condemned activity in the social spaces where the explicit reference would have been inappropriate. The vocabulary of the moralizing tradition was the vocabulary of condemnation. the specific terms that the sermon and the theological treatise and the ecclesiastical court record used to describe the industry and its participants in the terms that the moral framework required. The meretricious, the term that the modern English has inherited in the adjectival form, meaning tawdry or falsely attractive, was the specific medieval adjective that designated the qualities associated with the commercial sex worker, and the specific trajectory of the word from the description of the person to the description of the quality to the modern meaning of the cheaply attractive is the specific linguistic history of the moralizing traditions vocabulary traveling through the centuries. The specific naming of the establishments was the vocabulary of the medieval commercial culture's relationship with the activity it was officially conducting unofficially. The Southwark stews were named. The individual establishments had the specific names that the contemporary documents record. The barge, the unicorn, the bell, the crane, the cardinal's hat, the sign of the cross. The naming of the establishments was the naming of the commercial enterprise. The specific branding that allowed the customer to specify his destination and allowed the neighborhood's social geography to be mapped in the specific terms of the commercial enterprise's geography. The cardinal's hat was the specifically pointed name. The specific establishment whose name made the same joke that the Winchester geese made, the knowing reference to the ecclesiastical presence in the commercial landscape of the Southwark stews. The cardinal's hat sat in the bishop's manor, in the licensed zone that the bishop's authority administered, and its name was the specific commercial daily reminder of the intersection between the ecclesiastical authority and the commercial sex industry that the medieval satirical tradition found inexhaustibly useful. The vocabulary that the women used among themselves, the specific internal language of the working community of the stews, is the vocabulary that the historical record does not preserve, because the historical record preserved the language of the literate and the powerful, rather than the language of the poor and the stigmatized. The internal language of the women of the stews was the spoken language of the working community, oral rather than written, vernacular rather than Latin, specific to the shared experience of the community rather than addressed to the external audience of the legal or the ecclesiastical document. It is gone. The Winchester geese have their own words for their own world, and we do not have them. Chapter 12. The Pilgrims, the specific, extraordinary fact that the medieval brothel and the medieval pilgrimage were often the same journey. The pilgrim stopped at Southwark, not as a detour from the pilgrimage, as the specific beginning of it. The Tabard Inn at Southwark, from which Chaucer's pilgrims set out on the Canterbury pilgrimage, was on the same street as the Southwark stews. The pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury began in the specific neighborhood of the licensed commercial sex establishments, in the specific taverns and the specific hostelries of the South Bank that served the pilgrim traffic heading toward the Kentish Road and the various other travelers whose journeys through the medieval commercial landscape brought them to the same geographic node. The pilgrimage and the brothel were not, in the medieval cultural imagination, the opposites that the modern moral framework tends to place them. The pilgrimage was a journey, and the journey was the journey that took the medieval traveler through the specific commercial establishments of the route, including the establishments that the domestic convention did not provide, and that the traveling situation made available. The pilgrim on the road was the pilgrim away from home, away from the specific social supervision of the home community, in the specific social freedom of the temporary traveler, whose behavior was observed by the traveling strangers rather than the permanent neighbors whose knowledge of his life was the specific social regulation of the permanent community, the partner of Chaucer's pilgrimage, the specific character whose commerce in the sacred objects of the pilgrimage tradition made him the specific embodied representative of the religious culture's commercial corruption, was traveling the same road as the knight and the prioress and the wife of Bath, all of them having begun at the Tabard, all of them in the specific geographic proximity of the Southwark stews. Chaucer placed the pilgrimage at Southwark with the specific knowing awareness of what the proximity meant, and the specific various humanity of the Canterbury pilgrims was the specific various humanity of the people who occupied the same commercial and moral landscape as the stews without any of them needing to acknowledge it. The specific traffic of the pilgrimage route created the specific commercial opportunity that the establishments along the route exploited. The pilgrim who needed accommodation, food, drink, and the various other commercial services that the journey required was the pilgrim who spent money at the establishments along the route, and the establishments along the route, including the Southwark establishments, were the commercial infrastructure of the pilgrimage economy. The medieval pilgrimage was, in its economic dimension, a significant commercial enterprise that generated income for every establishment along the route that the pilgrim traffic sustained. The specific relationship between the pilgrimage economy and the commercial sex industry was the relationship that the moralizing literature of the period documented with the resigned frequency of the observer who had noticed that the two activities occurred in proximity and that the proximity was not accidental. The pilgrim who arrived at the Southwark hostelry the night before the pilgrimage began was the pilgrim who was in the specific geographic proximity of the licensed stews, in the specific social situation of the person away from home in a commercial environment, with a specific combination of the travel, freedom, and the available commercial option that the proximity created. The Church's specific regulation of the pilgrim's behavior, the requirements of the religious conduct that the pilgrimage's sacred purpose demanded, was the regulation that the pilgrimage guides and the confessors who prepared the pilgrim for the journey specified. The regulation addressed the specific temptations of the pilgrim's journey. The regulation did not eliminate them. The Southwark stews that the pilgrimage traffic passed were the Southwark stews that the pilgrimage traffic used, and the specific frequency with which the medieval confessional literature addressed the pilgrim's encounters with the commercial sex industry along the pilgrimage route was the frequency of the regular occurrence rather than the exceptional one. The specific irony of the pilgrimage brothel geography was the irony of the medieval cultural landscape in miniature. The sacred and the profane sharing the same street, the same neighborhood, the same commercial infrastructure in the specific proximity that the medieval city's compressed geography produced. The Tabard Inn and the Cardinal's Hat were neighbors. The pilgrimage to the shrine of the martyred archbishop and the visit to the licensed brothel of the bishop's manor were not the opposite ends of the medieval moral universe. They were the institutions that occupied the same street, the same financial ecosystem, the same social world of the medieval Southwark that made no particular effort to separate the sacred commerce of the pilgrimage from the secular commerce of the stews. Chapter 13. The End. How the medieval regulated brothel system collapsed and what replaced it. The closure came suddenly. Henry VIII's proclamation of April 1546. The specific royal order that closed the Southwark stews and the other licensed commercial sex establishments of the English regulatory system was issued without the extensive deliberation and the elaborate justification that the significant policy change typically required. The proclamation was brief. The stews were to close. The women were to disperse. the operators were to cease operations. The specific institution that the 1,161 ordinances had established and that had operated under various forms of regulation for nearly 4 centuries was ended by a document that the king issued and the authorities implemented. The specific reasons for the 1546 closure are the reasons that the historians have debated with the specific uncertainty that the historical record's reticence on the subject produces. The syphilis was the reason most frequently cited by contemporaries and by subsequent historians. The specific epidemic that the new pathogen had produced in the English population since its arrival in the 1490s, and whose connection to the commercial sex industry the popular understanding had made specific and direct. The stews were the vector. Closing the stews was the specific public health intervention that the epidemic required, but the syphilis had been present in England for 50 years before the closure, 50 years during which the stews had continued to operate under the licensing system. The epidemic had not been sufficient reason to close the stews in 1500 or 1510, or 1520 or 1530. The specific timing of the 1546 closure requires the additional explanation that the syphilis alone does not provide. The Reformation was the additional explanation. The specific, transformative religious and cultural change that Henry VIII had inaugurated with the break from Rome, and that had by 1546 produced the specific cultural climate of the Protestant Reform, that found the licensed brothels specific combination of the official tolerance and the moral transgression more difficult to defend than the pre-Reformation culture had found it. The Protestant moral theology's specific emphasis on the discipline of the sexual life, on the rejection of the Augustinian tolerance of the lesser evil, on the specific cultural reformation that accompanied the theological reformation. This was the specific cultural context in which the 1546 closure was politically possible in a way that it had not been in the pre-Reformation decades. The specific pressure from the Protestant reformers who found the licensed brothel the specific, visible, institutional embodiment of the Catholic Church's moral accommodation of the sinful, the Augustinian lesser evil argument that the Protestant tradition found as repugnant as the indulgence, was the specific cultural and political pressure that the 1546 closure responded to, alongside the public health argument that the syphilis epidemic provided. The closure did not end the commercial sex industry. This was the specific predictable outcome of the specific policy that the medieval regulatory tradition had always predicted. The Augustinian argument that the removal of the regulated institution would not eliminate the demand, but would drive the industry underground, where it could not be supervised, and where the specific imperfect protections of the regulatory framework would no longer apply. The 1546 closure produced exactly this outcome. The underground industry that replaced the licensed stews was the industry of the bawdy house. The unlicensed, unregulated, geographically dispersed establishment that the constable's periodic suppression campaigns kept in constant motion without eliminating. The bawdy house was the successor institution to the medieval stew, operating without the license, without the formal regulatory framework, without the specific imperfect protections that the licensing system had provided for the workers. The women who had worked in the licensed stews found themselves in the specific, more precarious situation of the unregulated industry, without the formal right to leave that the ordinances had established, without the formal prohibition on excessive charges that the ordinances had prescribed, without the formal licensing authority that the collective complaint could be addressed to. The closure of the licensed establishment had not improved the situation of the women in the industry. It had removed the specific inadequate framework that had at least formally acknowledged their rights, leaving them in the specific, more exposed position of the worker in the unregulated economy. The legal suppression of the unregulated industry was the specific, repeated, ineffective policy instrument that the English authorities applied to the commercial sex industry for the subsequent centuries. The periodic crackdown, the constable's raid, the magistrate's prosecution, the sentence that the convicted woman served, and that resolved nothing about the structural conditions that had produced the industry's existence in the first place. The medieval regulatory system's specific pragmatism, the acknowledgement that elimination was impossible and management was therefore the available option, was replaced by the specific, principled, but practically futile policy of the suppression that produced the result the medieval pragmatists had predicted. Chapter 14. The Archaeology. What the ground remembers, that the documents forgot. The bones told the story that the records didn't. The specific material evidence of the medieval commercial sex industry's human cost is the evidence that the documentary record, the legal ordinances, the ecclesiastical condemnations, the administrative records, the literary satires, cannot provide with the specific direct physicality of the archaeological record. The document tells you what the institution was supposed to do. The bone tells you what it actually did to the specific human bodies that lived within it. The Crossbones burial ground at Southwark is the specific, extraordinary archaeological site that provides the material evidence of the human cost of the medieval commercial sex industry in its most direct and most unanswerable form. The site, the unconsecrated ground at the corner of Red Cross Way and Union Street in modern Southwark, 60 yards from the Jubilee Line's Borough Station, was the specific burial place of the outcast, dead of medieval and early modern Southwark, the people who could not be buried in the consecrated ground of the parish churchyard, the people whose specific circumstances, the moral transgression, the poverty, the foreign birth, the criminal conviction, had placed them outside the specific community of the consecrated burial. The Winchester geese were buried there. The women who had worked in the Bishop of Winchester's licensed stews, who had died in the specific conditions of the medieval working life in the commercial sex industry, who had been denied the specific religious right of the consecrated burial that the Church's condemnation of their occupation extended beyond the lifetime into the specific final disposition of the body. These women were among the dead of Crossbones. The 1992 excavation, the specific archaeological investigation that the construction of the Jubilee Line extension at Southwark required, and that the archaeologists of the Museum of London conducted in the exposed ground of the construction site, produced the specific skeletal material that the subsequent osteological analysis examined for the evidence of the human stories that the bones encoded. Approximately 148 skeletons in the medieval layer of the site. The osteological analysis providing the specific biological information, age at death, sex, stature, the specific pathological changes that the lifetime's physical experience had recorded in the bone, that the documentary record could not supply. The age profile of the medieval skeletons from Crossbones was the age profile of the population, whose specific circumstances had killed them young. Many of the female skeletons showed the specific osteological markers of the young adult, the bone density and the developmental markers that the osteologist reads as the evidence of the person in their 20s or 30s, rather than the older adult whose skeleton shows the specific changes of the later life. The early death that the medieval stew workers' specific occupational and social conditions produced was the early death that the bone's biological record confirmed. The specific pathological changes in the bone, the evidence of the nutritional deficiency, the infection, the specific physical stress of the occupational life, were the specific material record of the conditions that the documentary history described in the abstract, and that the bones described in the specific, physical, direct language of the biological evidence. The woman in the medieval stew, who had eaten inadequately, whose body bore the specific evidence of the chronic nutritional insufficiency of the medieval poor person's diet, whose bones showed the specific markers of the infection that the medieval stew's occupational health risks produced. This woman was present in the crossbones archaeological record in the specific physical form of her skeleton. The syphilis left marks in bone. The specific characteristic lesions that the tertiary syphilis produces in the skull, and the long bones of the person who has survived the acute phases of the infection and whose untreated disease has progressed to the stage where the bone is affected. The crossbones' skeletal material included the specific identifiable markers of the syphilitic infection in some of the individuals whose remains the 1992 excavation recovered. The disease that the documentary record described as the occupational risk of the commercial sex industry was present in the material record of the specific bones of the specific people who had died in Southwark. The crossbones site is now the subject of the specific contemporary, commemorative practice that the modern community of Southwark has organized around the memory of the people buried there. The monthly vigil that the local community holds at the Crossbones Gate, the decorated memorial gate at the entrance to the site, hung with the ribbons and the tokens, and the specific personal memorials that the participants bring, is the specific ongoing acknowledgement that the people buried in the unconsecrated ground of Crossbones are the people whose history the community has decided to remember. The archaeologist who lifted the specific bone from the specific layer of the excavated ground was handling the specific physical remains of the specific person who had lived the specific life that this script has attempted to describe. The woman whose world was the medieval stew, whose death was the early death of the specific occupational and social conditions, whose burial was the unconsecrated burial of the specifically excluded, and whose bone was the specific material, undeniable evidence that the history it represented was the history of a real person who had actually lived and actually died. The document is abstract. The bone is not. Chapter 15. The Mirror. What the medieval brothel tells us about every subsequent century, including our own. The medieval brothel did not end in 1546. It changed its name. It changed its address. It changed the specific regulatory framework, or the absence of the regulatory framework within which it operated. It changed the specific cultural vocabulary through which the surrounding society discussed it, and the specific moral frameworks through which the surrounding society condemned it and tolerated it and exploited it, and occasionally attempted to improve the conditions of the people within it. But the specific structural features of the medieval commercial sex industry, the demand that persisted regardless of the moral framework applied to it, the economic vulnerability of the workers, the power of the operators, the specific intersection of the stigma, and the exploitation that the combination of moral condemnation and economic necessity produced, the gap between the theoretical protections and the practical protections of the regulatory framework. These structural features did not end in 1546. They are the structural features of the commercial sex industry in every subsequent century, including the current one. The specific debate about the regulation versus the criminalization versus the abolition of the commercial sex industry that the contemporary policy discussion conducts is the specific contemporary version of the debate that the medieval authorities were conducting when they produced the 1161 ordinances. The Augustinian argument, regulate rather than prohibit, because prohibition drives the industry underground and makes the workers more vulnerable rather than less, is the argument that the modern harm reduction advocates make in the contemporary policy debate. The prohibitionist argument that the tolerance of the industry is the specific institutional validation of the exploitation that the industry represents, is the argument that the modern abolitionists make. Neither argument is new. The specific regulatory models that the contemporary world has produced, the full criminalization of the Nordic model that criminalizes the buyer rather than the seller, the full decriminalization of the New Zealand model that removes the criminal law from the consensual adult industry, the legalization with regulation of the German and Dutch models that license the establishments and impose the health and safety requirements, are the specific contemporary versions of the range of approaches that the medieval European city explored in its various models. The Southwark licensing, the German Frauenhaus, the Venetian regulated zone, the French municipal brothel. Each of these was the specific, medieval version of the regulatory approach that the contemporary world is still debating the merits of. The economic vulnerability of the workers is the specific constant across every century and every regulatory model. The woman in the medieval stew, whose debt to the stewkeeper made her practical departure difficult, despite the formal right to leave, is the specific medieval version of the structural vulnerability that the contemporary researchers in the commercial sex industry identify as the persistent feature of the industry's economic organization, regardless of the specific regulatory framework within which it operates. The debt bondage, the housing dependency, the economic alternatives that are worse than the current situation. These are the features of the industry that the regulatory framework has never, in any of its historical forms, fully addressed. The public health dimension is the specific constant that the history from the gonorrhea of the medieval stew to the syphilis epidemic of the 1490s to the HIV epidemic of the 1980s and the specific contemporary STI landscape documents as the persistent structural feature of the industry's engagement with the disease, the specific technology of the public health response, the humoral treatment, the mercury, the penicillin, the antiretroviral, changes with the medical knowledge available in the specific historical moment. The specific public health challenge of the industry's occupational exposure to sexually transmitted infection does not change. The moral framework changes. The specific theological condemnation of the medieval church, the Victorian moral reformism of the rescue movement, the feminist abolitionist argument of the contemporary anti-trafficking campaign. Each of these is the specific moral framework of its specific historical moment, produced by the specific cultural, theological, and political context of that moment, addressing the same institution through the lens that the specific moment provides. Each believes itself to be saying something new. Each is saying something that the previous moral framework said differently. The women are the specific constant across every century and every moral framework and every regulatory model. The specific individual women whose economic vulnerability, whose specific biographical circumstances, whose particular navigation of the structural conditions that the industry presented in their specific historical moment. These women are the specific human reality that the regulatory debate, the moral condemnation, the theological tolerance, and the archaeological bonal, in their different ways, address. The medieval documentation remembered the bishop's rent. The medieval theology remembered the sin. The medieval satire remembered the hypocrisy of the ecclesiastical landlord. The crossbones ground remembered the women. The women were always the most important part of the story. Chapter 15. The myth. What popular culture got wrong about the medieval brothel and why the getting wrong matters. The Hollywood version has opinions about the medieval brothel, strong opinions, consistent opinions, opinions that have been reproduced across the fantasy film and the historical drama and the prestige television series with the specific uniformity of the visual language that has decided what the medieval brothel looks like and is not interested in revising the decision based on the evidence. The Hollywood medieval brothel is warm. It is candlelit in the specific amber glow that the period drama's cinematography has decided represents the past. The women are beautiful in the specific contemporary way of the casting director's preferences. The customers are either villains who treat the women badly, demonstrating their villainy, or sensitive protagonists who treat the women with unexpected respect, demonstrating their depth of character. The establishment is run by the specific stock, character of the knowing madame, wry, world-weary, secretly kind, who understands everything and judges no one. None of this is wrong in the specific sense of being individually impossible. There were candlelit medieval rooms. There were beautiful women in the medieval stews. There were customers of varying moral quality. There were operators whose character was more complex than the straightforward exploiter. But the aggregate picture that the Hollywood version produces, the specific, consistent, comfortable rendering of the medieval commercial sex industry as a place of warmth and amber light and complex humanity, is wrong in the specific sense of being wrong about the conditions. The conditions were not warm and amber lit. They were the conditions this script has spent 14 chapters describing. The disease, the violence, the economic exploitation, the lice in the straw mattress, the smell of the building that had not been adequately ventilated, the cold in winter when the fire management was inadequate, the specific legal precarity that made the woman in the stew the person whose complaint the constable was least likely to take seriously. The Hollywood medieval brothel is the specific aestheticized version of the institution that removes the specific conditions from the picture and replaces them with the specific aesthetic that the production designer has decided is more watchable. The more watchable version is more watchable. This is not a trivial observation. The entertainment industry's specific calculus, the calculation of what the audience will sustain for the duration of the episode, what conditions it can bear to watch, what degree of historical accuracy is compatible with the entertainment function, is a genuine calculation with genuine constraints. The accurate medieval stew would be difficult to watch for the specific reasons that it would have been difficult to be in. The substitution of the amber-lit warmth for the boohoo actual conditions is the specific substitution that the entertainment calculus requires, but the substitution has consequences. The specific persistent image of the medieval brothel as the warm, complex, humanly interesting establishment, rather than the cold, exploitative, medically dangerous institution, produces the specific distortion of the historical understanding that the popular culture's rendering of history always risks producing. The person who knows the medieval brothel from the prestige television drama knows a different institution from the person who knows it from the historical record, and the difference is not a difference of detail, but a difference of the fundamental nature of the place. The romanticization of the medieval brothel is the specific version of the broader romanticization of the medieval past that the popular culture consistently produces. The specific aesthetic of the warm firelight and the rough-hewn humanity and the uncomplicated moral clarity that the fantasy version of the medieval world offers as the alternative to the complicated, cold, morally ambiguous reality that the historical record documents. The medieval past that the popular culture presents is always the medieval past that is more comfortable to imagine than the medieval past that was actually lived. The discomfort of the accurate version is the discomfort of the history that does not allow the aesthetic enjoyment of the setting to distract from the specific human cost of the conditions. The crossbones burial ground is not amber lit. The bones of the Winchester geese are not warm. The unconsecrated ground where they were buried is not the set of the prestige television drama. The accurate version matters because the women of the medieval stews were real people whose specific experience of the specific conditions deserves the specific accuracy of the historical account rather than the specific comfort of the aesthetic substitution. The mythologized version is a version of the medieval brothel from which the women of the medieval brothel have been removed and replaced with the contemporary actress in the period costume in the production designer's medieval brothel. They are not the same. The myth is not harmless. The specific, persistent aesthetic of the warm and complex medieval brothel is the specific aesthetic that makes the institution feel like the place of human interest rather than the place of specific human exploitation. And the specific consequence of that aesthetic is the specific difficulty of thinking clearly about the structural conditions that produce the exploitation, because the aesthetic has already provided the more comfortable alternative. The history requires the discomfort. The discomfort is the point. The point is that the women were real and the conditions were real, and the easy version of both is not the honest version of either. Chapter 16. The name. Why the Winchester? Geese were remembered in our poetry, forgotten in history, and what we owe them now. John Slow remembered them. The specific Elizabethan antiquarian John Stow, whose 1598 survey of London is the specific documentary source that preserves more of the everyday detail of the medieval and Elizabethan city than almost any other single document, remembered the Winchester geese in the specific practical way of the man who was recording what had existed before the city changed. Stowe recorded the crossbones ground. He recorded the women buried there. He recorded the name by which they were known. He recorded that they had been denied the consecrated burial that the church's condemnation of their occupation had extended into the final disposal of their bodies. He recorded it without sentimentality and without the specific moral condemnation that the ecclesiastical tradition had applied. He recorded it as the specific fact of the specific place, that there was a burial ground here, that these women were buried in it, that they had been called Winchester geese, that they had been denied the churchyard. He recorded the fact of the women as the fact of the city, the specific human geography of the institution that the city had contained, and the ground that the institution had produced. John Donne remembered them differently. The specific poem attributed to Donne, the apparition with its specific bitter observation about the Winchester geese buried without the churchyard's blessing, was the literary remembering of the specific irony that the satirical tradition had been noting since the medieval period. The bishop's geese, buried without the bishop's blessing, the commercial property of the ecclesiastical landlord, denied the ecclesiastical right by the ecclesiastical institution that had profited from their commercial activity throughout their lives. Donne's poem was the poem of the knowing, bitter irony, the specific literary register of the observation that the institution's treatment of the women it had exploited was the observation that required the satirical distance of the poem, rather than the documentary distance of the survey. The poetic memory and the documentary memory were the two forms of the remembering that the Elizabethan period produced for the Winchester geese. And then the remembering largely stopped. The 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century passed with the Crossbones ground, becoming the specific, unremarkable patch of South London ground that the city built over and around, and eventually forgot the specific history of. The ground was there, the bones were in it. The name of what the ground had been was in Stowe's survey for the scholars who read Stowe's survey. The Winchester geese were in the ground, and not much elsewhere. The 1992 excavation was the specific moment of the rediscovery. The moment when the Jubilee Line construction exposed the ground and the archaeologists found the bones, and the bones were the specific, material, undeniable reintroduction of the Winchester geese into the contemporary memory of the city they had lived and died in. The bone cannot be dismissed. The bone cannot be reclassified. The bone is the specific physical evidence of the specific person who had lived the specific life that the bone's biological record encodes. And the excavation of 1992 was the excavation that made the dismissal or the reclassification or the forgetting specifically impossible for the people who saw the bones and understood what they were looking at. The poet John Constable, not the painter, a different John Constable, began the specific commemorative practice of the Crossbones Vigil in 1996 in response to the 1992 excavation and the specific sustained attention to the Crossbones site that the excavation had produced in the local community. The monthly vigil that Constable organized, the gathering at the gate of the Crossbones site, the reading of the names of the outcast dead, the placing of the ribbons and the tokens on the gate that the community had decorated as the specific material memorial to the people buried inside, was the specific contemporary form of the remembering that the medieval period had denied the Winchester geese, and that the modern community was providing retrospectively. The gate is remarkable, the specific decorated gate of the Crossbones Memorial. The iron gate covered with the ribbons and the flowers, and the written messages and the small objects left by the people who have visited the site and wanted to leave the specific personal memorial that the individual's response to the history requires, is one of the more extraordinary memorial objects in modern London. It is not a formal memorial. It was not commissioned by the city or designed by an architect or unveiled by a dignitary. It is the accumulated individual specific memorial of the people who came to the gate and found that the history required something more than the acknowledgement of the fact. The ribbons are left by the women who recognize something in the Winchester geese's specific story. The ribbon are left by the historians and the archaeologists who understand the Crossbones bones as the specific material evidence of the historical reality they have been studying. The ribbons are left by the Southwark residents who live 60 yards from the Jubilee Line and who have learned that the ground under their neighborhood is the ground that contains the specific human cost of the medieval city's specific institutional arrangement. The ribbons are left by people who cannot fully articulate why they are leaving them, but who feel the specific pull of the history that the gate represents, the pull of the past that is not past, the pull of the people who are real and are present in the specific material form of the bone, in the ground, and the gate above it. The name Winchester geese was the name that mocked them in life. It was the name that Stowe recorded in 1598. It is the name that the contemporary community uses when it holds the vigil and speaks the names of the outcast dead at the Crossbones Gate. The name has traveled from the medieval satire through the Elizabethan survey, through the Victorian obscurity, through the 1992 excavation to the contemporary memorial, and at each point of the journey, it has carried the specific weight of the history it belongs to, the bishop's rent, and the unconsecrated ground, and the syphilitic bone, and the gate covered in the ribbons that the modern community leaves for the people who were buried without mourning. The Winchester geese are remembered now, not in the amber-lit warmth of the prestige television drama, not in the specific comfort of the mythology, in the specific, honest, materially grounded way of the history that refuses the comfortable version and insists on the accurate one. The bone in the ground, the gate above it, the ribbon on the gate, the name spoken at the monthly vigil in the specific contemporary Southwark Street that runs over the specific medieval burial ground where the bishop's geese were laid without blessing in the unconsecrated earth. They were denied the name of the saint. They were given the name of the bishop. They kept it. It kept them. And 60 yards from where you change trains, in the ground, under the street of the modern city, the bones of the Winchester geese are keeping the specific, final, unignorable record of the specific human cost of the specific medieval institution whose history this script has tried to tell honestly. The gate is open on the last Friday of each month. If you are in Southwark, go. Conclusion: why you wouldn't last, and what that means you are standing outside the building for the last time. The timber-framed building on the Southwark Street, with its sign above the door, and its smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies and cheap ale, and the specific accumulated organic contributions of the medieval commercial space. The building that the bishop's license permitted on the bishop's land, in the bishop's manor, generating the bishop's rent from the women the bishop's theology condemned. You wouldn't last a single night. We established this at the beginning, and the script has spent its entirety explaining why. The disease without treatment, the violence without reliable recourse, the economic exploitation without the protections of the modern employment relationship, the sanitary conditions of the medieval built environment, the specific social and legal stigma that attached to everyone inside the building, the workers, the operators, the customers, in different ways and different degrees, but attached to all of them, staining the visit with the specific moral weight that the medieval culture could not detach from the activity, even when it was officially licensing the activity. But the reason you wouldn't last a night is also the reason the history matters. You wouldn't last because the conditions were genuinely, specifically, documentably bad. Not bad in the vague, general sense of the past being worse than the present, but bad in the specific, particular human sense of the individual people living in the specific conditions that this script has described, navigating the specific challenges that those conditions presented, surviving or not surviving, on the specific terms that the medieval commercial sex industry offered. The history of the medieval brothel is not the titillating history that the sensationalized version presents. It is not the straightforwardly grim history that the moralistic version presents. It is the specific, complex human history of an institution that the medieval world could not eliminate, could not properly protect the workers of, could not honestly acknowledge its own investment in, and could not stop simultaneously condemning and exploiting. The bishop collected the rent. The women were buried in unconsecrated ground. The cardinal's hat advertised its presence on the street named for the cardinal's employer. The pilgrims set out for Canterbury from the inn next door. The Augustinian argument justified the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework justified the bishop's financial stake. The financial stake made the theological condemnation more manageable as an abstraction than as a policy. The medieval world was not unique in any of this. It was the specific medieval version of the arrangements that every subsequent century has made with the same institution, the specific accommodations and the specific hypocrisies and the specific failures of the regulatory imagination that the commercial sex industry has produced in every era that has tried to address it. The medieval period produced the stews, and the Winchester geese, and the bishop's rent, and the crossbones burial ground. The subsequent periods produced their own versions of the same arrangements. The women paid the price in every version. The crossbones gate at Southwark is decorated with ribbons and tokens, and the specific personal memorials that the people who visit it leave. The vigil is held monthly. The community remembers the people buried in the unconsecrated ground, whose lives the documentary record addressed as a management problem, and whose bones the archaeological record addressed as the material evidence of the management problem's human cost. The Winchester geese are remembered now in the specific contemporary form of the communal mourning that the modern Southwark has organized for the specifically unmourned. They are mourned now in the unconsecrated ground that the bishop designated for them, 60 yards from the Jubilee line, in the specific modern city built on the specific medieval ground where they lived and worked and died. The bishop's rent is long collected. The cardinal's hat is long demolished. The 1,161 ordinances are long superseded. The crossbones ground is still there. The bones are still there. The history is still there, not as the remote past of the irrelevant institution, but as the specific, grounded, materially present history of the people whose lives built the city that the modern person walks through daily without knowing whose bones are under the street. You wouldn't last a single night. They lasted their whole lives. That is the difference. That is the history. That is the thing the script was trying to say.